The morning they brought the Duchess of Wensley into Westminster Hall to be tried for her husband's murder, the frost had not yet left the high windows, and the light that fell across the cold stone floor was the color of weak tea. She walked between two ushers in a gown of plain gray wool, her hands bare, her hair drawn back without a single ornament, and 300 faces turned at once to watch her come. Some of those faces she had dined beside. Some had bowed to her at the door of her own drawing room. Now they leaned forward together, a single great animal of curiosity, to see whether she would weep. She did not weep. She found the rail with both hands and stood very still, and the silence that gathered around that stillness was its own kind of verdict. At the far end of the hall, raised above them, all on a dais of dark oak, sat the men who would decide whether she lived. Among them, near the right, a tall man in a coat the color of midnight watched her without moving, and only the slight tightening at the corner of his jaw betrayed that he had found, in the whole of that vast cold room, the one person who could not look away from her. His name was Sebastian, the Earl of Wessenden, and he was the only man on that dais who had ever heard her laugh. What the room did not yet know was that the truth of the old Duke's death was sitting 2 benches behind the witnesses in the gray dress of a still-room maid, with her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. To understand how a duchess came to stand at that rail, one must go back to a colder season, and to a girl who had married above her station, and learned that the world keeps a long memory for such a thing. Charlotte Ashcombe had not been born to any of it. Her father had been a clergyman of modest living, in a damp parish near the coast, a man with more books than coin, and when he died he left her a good hand for accounts, a steady eye, and £300 that did not last. She had gone into the household of the Duke of Wensley as a companion to his ailing first wife, to read aloud in the long evenings and to manage the linen and the lamp oil and the small economies of a great house run carelessly. She had expected nothing more than a place. She had been 24 when the first Duchess died, and 26 when the old Duke, grey and gouty and lonely past bearing, asked her to be the second. The world had its word for what she was, the moment the banns were read. To the families who had hoped to place their own daughters at Halsworth Hall, she was an adventuress. The word traveled the way such words do in the soft voices of women who smiled at her over the rims of their cups. The dowager lady who held the neighboring seat said at first in a private aside, to her own daughter on the terrace, certain the wind would not carry it, that the new Duchess was nothing but an adventuress who had nursed her way into a coronet. Tea. Charlotte had been below the terrace, gathering the late roses, and she had heard every syllable, and she had gone on cutting the roses with hands that did not shake. She had not married Ormond for love. She would not pretend, even to herself, that she had. She had been kind to him, however, and that is not nothing, and in the 2 years of their marriage, she had given the old man the only easy hours he had known since his first wife sickened. She read to him. She learned which chair eased his hip, and which broth he could keep down. She kept the household honest, dismissed the steward who had been bleeding the estate for a decade, and balanced the books herself by candlelight when the men who were paid to do it could not be troubled. The tenants came to know that the Duchess answered her own door, and that she remembered the names of their children, and that when the fever went through the low cottages by the mill, she sent broth and coal and her own physician without being asked. None of that made the smallest difference to the families who had wanted her place. To them she remained the adventuress, and an adventuress everyone agreed would not stop at marriage. It was at the harvest of her second married autumn that the Earl of Wessenden came to Halsworth, and the house changed its weather without anyone quite saying so. It came on the old Duke's business, for Sebastian held a long lease of the eastern coverts, and there was a question of drainage and a wall fallen between 2 fields. He was 36, lean and dark, with a way of going still before he spoke that made men measure their words around him. He had been a soldier, and then a magistrate, and grief had passed through him some years before and left its mark, for he had buried a young wife and an infant son in the same hard winter, and had not been seen to smile since. The county called him cold. Charlotte, who had been called worse, did not believe in cold men. She believed in men who had been burned and had learned to stand close to nothing. He arrived, expecting to spend an hour with the Duke over a map. He found instead that the Duke was abed with his hip, and that it was the Duchess who unrolled the survey on the long library table and put her finger on the failed culvert and explained, in plain, unhurried sentences, exactly where the water went and why the wall had come down and what it would cost to set right. She did not flatter him. She did not pretend to know less than she did. When he questioned a figure, she showed him the column in the steward's book where the error had been buried, and she did not gloat when he conceded the point. He stayed 3 days. On the second, he came into the library to find her at the accounts, with ink on her wrist and a smudge of it on her cheek, and a single oil lamp burning, though the afternoon was not yet gone, because she begrudged the wax. He stood in the doorway longer than a man calls on a married woman ought, and he said only that she kept better books than his own agent, his voice low, and went away again. She told herself it meant nothing. Her hand, going back to the column, was not quite steady, and she despised her hand for it. That winter the old Duke worsened. The gout climbed from his foot to his knee and then settled, dark and dangerous, in his chest. Mr. Argyle! Drummond, the apothecary from the market town, came twice a week with his powders and his lancet, and the great house drew its breath and held it. And into that holding of breath came the old Duke's nephew, who was also his heir, Marius. Lord Brandwell was a young man of expensive habits and a small fortune already spent. He was the son of the Duke's dead younger brother, and he stood next in the line, and he had been waiting for Halsworth, the way a man waits for a coach in the rain, with mounting and ill-concealed impatience. He arrived in November on the pretext of attending his dying uncle, took the best guest apartments, ran up accounts in the market town in the Duke's name, and watched Charlotte across the dinner table with an expression she could not at first read. She read it soon enough. He had reckoned the moment he understood his uncle was dying, that a young widow of low birth and no great family behind her would be the easiest obstacle a man ever stepped over. He made his first attempt at the obstacle. Gently. He suggested, walking with her in the cold garden, that when his uncle was gone she would naturally wish to retire to some modest establishment, and that he would see her comfortably settled, and that an arrangement between them sensibly made now would spare them both unpleasantness later. She understood that the comfort and the arrangement were the same coin, and that the price of both was her quiet disappearance and her silence about the state of the estate she had spent 2 years saving. She declined. She declined in the level, courteous voice she used for tenants who had not paid, and Marius smiled, and she saw that she had made an enemy who would not show his face. The old Duke died on a Tuesday in January, in the gray hour before dawn, with Charlotte holding the cup of barley water to his lips and Mr. Drummond's last powder still bitter on his tongue. By the end of that same week, the word in the servants' hall was poison. It began, as these things begin, with a whisper that no one would own. The Duke had been failing for months, and old men with bad chests die in January, and not one physician had thought his death strange while it was happening. Then, a fortnight after the burial, information was laid before the magistrates that the late Duke of Wensley had died, not of his chest, but of arsenic, administered over many days in his food and his physic, and that the hand which had administered it was the hand of his low-born wife, who stood to be turned out with nothing if he lived, and who had been seen, more than one witness would swear. Alone in the still room where the household's tonics were mixed, the information was laid by Marius. He did not lay it in his own name. He had a man of business for that, and a sergeant at law named Holborn, already retained, and a story already shaped before the constables ever came to Halsworth. When they came, they found in a locked cabinet, in the still room to which the Duchess kept the only key, a paper of white arsenic, with 3 doses gone. And they found in Mr. Court Drummond's own apothecary ledger and entry, neat and unhurried, recording the sale of that very paper of arsenic to the Duchess of Wensley for the destruction of rats 6 weeks before her husband died. Charlotte had never bought arsenic in her life. She had never killed a rat that the cat had not killed first. Yet the paper was in her cabinet, and the entry was in the ledger, and she had no proof on this earth that she had not written her name where it stood because the hand that had written it had been taught to copy hers. She was arrested on a morning of hard rain, and because a duchess accused of murder cannot be tried by ordinary men, she was committed to be tried by the assembled peers of the realm in Westminster Hall, with a Lord High Steward presiding, and the whole of the nobility for her jury. The date was set for the first week of spring. She was given a cold room and a single candle, and a great deal of time in which to consider that she was going to die for a thing she had not done, and that no one in the world with the standing to save her had any reason to wish to. Stay with this part of it, because it is where the story turns, and it does not turn the way the great men in that hall expected. There was one person at Hallsworth who knew the truth, and she was 18 years old and frightened nearly out of her wits, and her name was Sally Coram. Sally had come to the still room as a girl of 14, the daughter of a tenant whose cottage had flooded the spring. The new Duchess set the drainage right. She mixed the tonics under Charlotte's eye and scrubbed the marble and kept the key cupboard, and she had reason, more than any soul in the house, to love the woman who had taught her to read a recipe, and had given her mother coal in the hard winter, and had never once raised a voice to her. Sally had been in the still-room passage on a night in December when she ought to have been abed. She had seen Lord Brandwell come down the cold corridor with a candle of his own, and let himself into the still-room with a key that should not have existed, and she had seen him bent over the small cabinet, and she had smelled the next morning the bitter almond ghost that arsenic leaves on a careless thumb. She had said nothing. She had said nothing, because 3 days after the constables came, Lord Brandwell had found her alone at the linen press, and had explained to her, very quietly, very kindly, the facts of her situation. He told her that her word, the word of a tenant's daughter and a still-room maid, weighed precisely nothing against the word of an earl's heir. He told her that her father held his cottage at the pleasure of the estate, and that the estate would shortly be his, and that a girl who told tales would find her whole family turned onto the road in March with the frost still in the ground. He told her last that if she spoke against him she would be charged as an accomplice to the murder, for had she not had the key of the cupboard, and was it not as easy to hang two as one? And then he gave her a guinea, and told her to think of her mother, and walked away whistling. Sally took the guinea because she did not dare refuse it, and she carried it like a coal in her pocket, and she did not sleep. While Sally lay awake in her cold attic, the Earl of Wessenden was doing the one thing his rank and his temper made possible. He could not free a prisoner committed for trial before the peers. He could not, as a peer who would sit in judgment, be seen to interest himself in her cause without poisoning it further. He could, however, ask questions, quietly, in the country, where his name opened doors that a constable's never would. He went first to Mr. Drummond. He had known the apothecary 20 years, had been physicked by him as a boy, and he sat in the low back room that smelled of camphor and dried herbs, and asked to see, not the damning entry but the rest of the ledger. Mr. Nasta. Drummond, who had been badly frightened and had begun to suspect he had been made a fool of, brought him the book. Sebastian read it the way he had once read a forged requisition in a regiment, slowly with a soldier's patience for the place where a lie has to join itself to the truth. The entry recording the sale of arsenic to the Duchess stood on a page dated the previous November. It was set down in a clear, careful script. It was, Mr. Rapp. Drummond admitted, written in a hand that was not quite his own, though it was very like, and he could not for his life remember writing it, and he was an old man, and his memory was not what it had been, and he had been so very afraid when the constables came that he had not dared to say so. Sebastian asked one question. He asked whether anyone, in the weeks before the Duke died, had been alone with the ledger. And Mr. Ting. Drummond, going slowly grey, remembered that Lord Brandwell had sat with him a full afternoon that November, drinking his brandy and asking idle questions about the great house, and that the ledger had lain open on the counter the whole of that time, and that he had stepped into the yard more than once and left his lordship alone with it. It was something. It was not enough. A forged hand may be alleged and never proved, and the word of a frightened apothecary against the heir to a dukedom would be brushed aside like a cobweb. Sebastian needed the still room. He needed the key. He needed a living witness who had seen the thing done, and the only living witness in the world was a girl of 18, who had been bought with a guinea and a threat, and he did not yet know she existed. He almost did not find her. He found her because Charlotte, in the one interview her counsel was permitted to carry between them, sent him not a plea for herself, but a request for someone else. Through the bars of that cold room she had said, her voice level, that whatever became of her, the Earl must see that no harm came to the still-room girl, Sally, who was a good child and an honest one, and who had no people to protect her. She had said it, because it was the thing she could still do, and because she had seen the morning of her arrest, how white the girl's face had gone, and a duchess who has spent 2 years remembering the names of her tenants' children does not forget a frightened child, even when the rope is being measured for her own neck. Sebastian, writing back from that interview, turned the request over in his mind the way one turns a stone to see what is beneath it. A woman about to die does not waste her last words on a servant unless the servant matters. Why should this one matter? He went to Hulsworth, where Marius now sat in the old duke's chair as though the trial were a formality already concluded, and he asked with the careless authority of a great neighbor to see how the household did. And in the still-room doorway he found a girl scrubbing a marble slab that was already clean, scrubbing it over and over with her head down, and when he said her name kindly she flinched as though he had struck her. He did not press her. That was the whole of his art with frightened things, and he had learned it the hard way. He said only that the Duchess had asked after her, had wished her kept safe, had named her a good and honest child, and he watched the words go into the girl like a knife. Sally put down her brush and turned away and wept into the corner of her apron, and Sebastian stood very still and let her weep. And after a while he said, his voice low, that if ever she wished to tell anyone anything, she might tell him, and that his name would stand between her and any harm on this earth, and that it was a name that could do it. Then he left her, because a thing forced is a thing broken, and he wanted her whole. He did not know if she would come. He rode back to take his seat among the peers, with nothing in his hands but an old man's failing memory, and a girl's tears, and the certainty, hard and cold in his chest, that the woman who kept better books than his agent, and would not flatter him, and had spent her last free breath on a servant, was going to be hanged in the spring, unless something he could not yet see came to pass. Before it came to pass, the dark hour came first, as it always does. On the second day of the trial, Surgeon Holborn rose for the crown and laid the case against the Duchess of Wensley before the assembled peers, with the smooth, regretful certainty of a man who has been very well paid to seem reluctant. He spoke of motive, of a low-born wife who would lose everything the moment her aged husband died, and who therefore had every reason to wish him to linger only long enough to alter his will in her favor, and to die before he thought better of it. He spoke of opportunity, of the still room to which she alone kept the key, of the cabinet that had held the arsenic. He spoke of proof, and he produced the apothecary's ledger, and he read aloud, in a voice that carried to the cold, high windows, the entry recording the sale of white arsenic to the Duchess herself. Then he called his witnesses, and one of them was the Halsworth butler, Mr. T. Falkland, a grey, careful man who had served the Duke 30 years and now served the heir, and who testified, not meeting her eyes, that he had more than once seen the Duchess go alone to the still room in the small hours and had thought nothing of it at the time and thought a great deal of it now. It was a small betrayal, and a complete one. Charlotte watched the man she had trusted, with the keys of her house, repeat the words that had been put in his mouth, and she understood that the same fear that had bought him had bought everyone, and that fear is the cheapest currency a great man ever spends. And there, in the witnessing of it, came the third voicing of the thing they had decided she was. Marius himself, sitting at his counsel's elbow with the calm of a man watching a debt collected, leaned to appear beside him and said, low but not so low that the benches nearby could not hear, that one ought never to be surprised at what an adventuress would do to keep a coronet she had no birthright to. The words ran along the benches like cold water. Charlotte heard them, and her chin did not lift, and the only sign she gave was a slow closing of one hand upon the rail, until the knuckles whitened the same gesture, had anyone known it, that a frightened girl 2 benches behind was making at that very moment in her lap. That night, in the cold room with the single candle, Charlotte allowed herself, for the first and only time, to believe that she would die. She had kept hope at arm's length, the way she kept everything that could undo her. But the butler's averted eyes had done what the indictment could not. She thought of the rope, and of the small gray crowd that would come to watch a duchess hang, and of the word they would carry away with them and teach to their children. Adventuress. She thought she could bear the dying. She found she could not bear the word outlasting her. She sat with her back very straight on the edge of the hard cot, because she had decided long ago that whatever else they took, they would not have the sight of her bent, and she did not weep, and the candle burned down, and somewhere across the cold city a girl of 18 sat up in the dark and made a different decision. Sally could not read the law, but she could count. She counted the guinea in her pocket against the face of the woman who had taught her to read a recipe. She counted her father's cottage against the broth and the coal of the hard winter. She counted the thread of the rope around her own neck against the certainty of the rope around another's, and she found, sitting in the dark, that the sum would not come right whichever way she set it down, except one. She had been told her word weighed nothing. She had been told it so often and so kindly that she had nearly come to believe it. And yet the Earl of Wessenden had said in the still-room doorway that his name would stand between her and any harm on this earth. And the Duchess, with a rope being measured for her own neck, had spent a breath she could not spare to ask that a still-room girl be kept safe. A word that 2 such people thought worth protecting could not, Sally reasoned, weigh quite nothing after all. She went up before dawn in her one good dress and walked 4 miles in the dark to the inn where the Earl of Wessenden lodged during the trial, and she gave the guinea to the startled boy who answered the door and told him to wake his lordship and say that the still-room girl had come to tell the truth. And Sebastian, who had not been sleeping, came down in his shirt with a candle and listened to her for an hour in the cold parlor, and wrote down every word in his own hand, and at the end of it he did a thing he had not done in years. He took the frightened girl's 2 cold hands in his, and told her she had more courage than half the men in that hall, and meant it. And Sally, who had been told her whole life that she was nothing, sat in a strange inn before dawn, and felt, for the first time, a written statement, however, is not testimony, and a maid cannot rise in Westminster Hall and demand to be heard. The Crown had closed its case. It remained for the defense, such as it was, to call its witnesses. And a peer's heir, who has retained a sergeant-at-law and bought a butler, does not leave the back door unwatched. When Marius learned, through a servant of his own, who had marked the still-room girl's absence at the morning fire, that Sally had walked off in the dark, he understood at once where she had gone and what it meant, and he moved to close the door she had opened. He did it cleverly, which is the only kind of antagonist worth the name. He did not deny that the girl might say wild things. He went to Sergeant Holborn and arranged that, should the still-room maid be produced, she would be met not with denial but with destruction. He furnished his counsel with a second paper, hastily got, but plausible, a sworn information from the Halsworth housekeeper that Sally was a thief who had been caught the previous year with the late Duchess's brooch in her apron, and was therefore a girl of no character, whose word against her betters was the desperate invention of a creature who feared to be turned off without a reference. It was a lie, but it was a lie with a date and a witness and a missing brooch, and it had hanged better people than a still-room maid. Marius had not risen to where he stood by leaving evidence unguarded. He guarded this one. He set his trap and sat back, certain that whatever the Earl produced, he had already poisoned the well it would draw from. So when Sebastian rose on the third day and asked leave of the Lord High Steward to call a witness in the prisoner's defense, and the doors at the back of the hall opened, and the small grey figure of Sally Coram came down the long stone floor between the staring benches with her chin up because the Earl had told her to keep it up, Marius did not flinch. He had a knife ready for her throat, and he meant to use it the moment she opened her mouth. She came to the place set for witnesses. She was sworn, and her voice when she gave her name shook so that the peers in the back benches leaned forward to hear it. And then Sebastian, standing near her, asked her in a low, steady voice, the voice he had used on frightened horses and frightened men for half his life, to tell the peers of the realm what she had seen in the still-room passage on a night in December. She told them. She faltered, and she went back, and she got it wrong once and corrected herself, which is the way truth comes out of a frightened mouth, and the way a rehearsed lie never does. She told them of Lord Branwell coming down the cold corridor with his own candle. She told them of the key that should not have existed, and the cabinet, and the bitter almond ghost on the morning air. She told them of the linen press and the guinea, and the threat against her father's cottage, and the promise that it was as easy to hang two as one. The hall, which had come to watch a duchess weep, sat in a silence so complete that the settling of a coal in the great fireplace sounded like a dropped sword. Then Sergeant Holborn rose, smooth and sorrowful, and drew his knife. He asked Sally almost gently whether it was not true that she had been caught the previous spring with her late mistress's brooch concealed in her apron. He asked whether she had not been kept on out of charity, against the housekeeper's advice. He asked whether she did not know very well that the moment the household passed to its rightful heir, she would be turned off without a character, and whether this whole tale was not the revenge of a dismissed thief who had nothing left to lose. He produced the housekeeper's information and let its date and its witness fall into the silence like stones. He had broken stronger witnesses than this. He watched the girl's face go white and waited for the tears that would finish her. The tears came. Sally stood in the great hall with 300 lords staring at her, and the lie about the brooch settling over her like a shroud, and she wept, and for a moment it seemed that Marius had won, that the truth would drown in a dead girl's brooch and a frightened maid's tears, and the word would outlast the woman after all. And then the Duchess of Wensley spoke for the first time in 3 days, from the rail where prisoners are not permitted to speak, and the Lord High Steward did not silence her, because something in the room had shifted, and even the man with the white staff felt it. She did not defend herself. That was the thing that struck them, the thing they spoke of, for years after. She did not say one word in her own cause. She said in the level voice she had used for tenants who could not pay, and for a dying old man and for an apothecary's failed memory, that the brooch had not been stolen. She said that she herself had given it to Sally in the hard winter 2 years gone, when the girl's mother lay sick and there was no money for the physician, and that she had told the girl to pawn it and say nothing, and that she had recorded the gift in her own household book on the 3rd page of that January's accounts, where any man who cared to look might find it in her own hand, and that the housekeeper who now called it theft had been the one she sent into the market town to redeem it back a month later, so that the late Duke need never know his wife had given away a brooch to keep a tenant's child from burying her mother. There was no sound in Westminster Hall. She had not raised her voice. She had named a page and a date and a sum, the way she named everything, and the peers nearest the front, who had handled estate books all their lives, knew at once that this was not the speech of a poisoner, but the dry, exact recall of a woman who had kept her own accounts by candlelight to save the wax. And the housekeeper's information, which had been a knife, lay on the floor of the hall, a broken thing, because a lie about a stolen brooch cannot survive the calm production of the page on which the gift was written 2 years before any trial was dreamed of, in a hand the whole county knew. It was then that Sebastian moved. He had said almost nothing in 3 days. He had sat among the peers and held his peace and let the crown spend itself, because he had known that the moment for the minimum sufficient word had not yet come, and that to spend it early was to waste it. Now he rose, in his coat the color of midnight, and he did not make a speech, and he did not match Holborn's smoothness with smoothness of his own. He turned to the Lord High Steward, and he said that he held in his hand the apothecary Mr. Bull. Drummond's own sworn statement that the entry recording the sale of arsenic to the Duchess was written in a hand not his own, on an afternoon when Lord Brandwell had sat alone with the open ledger, and that he held also the still-room maid's account, now corroborated in its every particular by the prisoner's household book, and that he would ask one question of the court, and then sit down. He asked that the original information, the very paper that had set the law upon the Duchess of Wensley, be brought forward and its informant named aloud, so that the peers might know in whose hand the accusation had first been written. And he said, his voice level, that he believed they would find it the same hand that had written the false entry in the apothecary's book, and that a man of letters among them might compare the two in a quarter of an hour. It was the whole of his defense, and it was enough, because it was true, and because the woman at the rail had already broken the well the lie was drawn from. Marius did not break all at once. He was not that kind of man. He rose smooth as his counsel, and said that this was outrageous, that the word of a thieving maid and a senile apothecary and a desperate murderess could not be set against the honor of a peer's heir, and that he demanded the slanders be struck from the record. He mounted his defense, and he mounted it well, with all the cold confidence of a man whose script had carried him through every room he had ever entered. The script had never been written for this room, though, where the page of an old household book lay open, beside a forged ledger and an honest girl's tears, and where two specimens of his own clear hand were already being carried up the long floor to a peer who had a good eye for documents. He talked, and the talking went on a beat too long, and the peers who had leaned toward him began, one by one, to lean away. And Marius felt the room turn under him the way a man feels the deck go in a sea he was sure of, and for the first time in his life, his confident, ruinous certainty failed him in the middle of a sentence, and he stopped. And the stopping was louder than any confession. The comparison of the hands took less than the quarter hour the Earl had promised. The Lord High Steward did not pronounce upon Lord Brandwell that day. That was a matter for another proceeding. And it came in its season, and the law moved upon him slowly and surely, as the law in that country always did. Upon the charge before the peers, however, it pronounced at once. The Duchess of Wensley was acquitted, fully and without a stain, by the assembled lords of the realm, and the word that ran along the benches now was not the word that had been whispered on a terrace and shouted in a courtroom. The peers who had come to watch a low-born woman hang rose instead as she was led from the rail, not all of them, but enough. And the rising of them was the county's recognition correcting itself in the only language it had. Charlotte did not weep then, either. She stood a moment where the rail had been, a free woman in a plain gray gown, and she looked down the long stone floor and found, 2 benches back, a still-room girl with a tear-streaked face, and her chin held up the way she had been told to hold it. And the Duchess of Wensley walked the length of Westminster Hall through the parting lords, and stopped in front of the maid, and took both her cold hands the way the Earl had taken them in the dark, and said, so quietly, that only Sally heard it, that she would never want a place while Charlotte had a roof, and that she had been braver than the whole of that hall. And the girl who had been told her word, weighed nothing, wept again. But it was a different weeping, and the lords nearest pretended not to see it because some of them had the grace to be ashamed. Sebastian found her in the cold antechamber where they had let her wait for her own carriage, alone, because the people who would have crowded a guilty duchess did not know yet how to approach an innocent one. He did not cross the room with any haste. He came to her, the way he came to everything, deliberate and quiet. And he stood before her at last with the day's gray light on the marks grief had left in his face, and for a long moment neither of them said the thing that had been true since a winter afternoon in a library that smelled of ink and lamp oil. Then he said her name. He said Charlotte simply, with no title before it, the first time in 2 years he had let himself, and the giving of her own plain name back to her, after a courtroom had spent 3 days reducing her to a word undid something in her that the rope had not touched. She said his name in return, the once, and it was not a duchess speaking to an earl. It was a woman who kept honest books speaking to the one man who had read them and not looked away. He told her, his voice level, that he had loved her since the afternoon she put her finger on the failed culvert, and would not flatter him, and that he had held his peace for 2 years because she was a married woman, and he was a man who did not take what was not his, and that he had nearly lost her to a lie because he had been too careful and too late, and that he did not intend to be too late again. He did not kneel, and he did not make a long speech because he was not a man for either. He took her ink-stained hand, which the cold room had left cold, and he warmed it between both of his, and he asked her plainly whether, when the law had finished its business with Lord Brandwell and a decent year had passed, she would do him the honor she had done his neighbor, and keep his books and his name and himself for the rest of their lives. She did not answer at once. She had learned the cost of quick answers. She looked at the dark coat and the grief-marked face and the 2 hands that warmed her cold one, and she thought of 2 years of measuring her words and keeping hope at arm's length, and she let it go at last, the long-held breath of it, and she said yes. And then she said, with the ghost of the dryness she had not been able to afford in 3 days, that he had better look at her accounts first, for she was a notorious adventuress, and could not be trusted near a coronet. And the Earl of Wessenden, who the county said had not smiled since he buried his wife and his son, smiled once, briefly, and it was to the one woman who saw it a more astonishing thing than any acquittal. They were married the following spring, quietly, in the small grey church near the coast where her father had once preached, with the sea grumbling beyond the churchyard wall and the bare trees just beginning to bud. There was no great wedding, no crush of the families who had called her an adventuress. Most of them had discovered urgent reasons to be elsewhere, and Charlotte found she did not miss them. Sally stood up with her, in a new dress the color of soft green, no longer a still-room maid, but a girl with a place for life, and people who would never let her be turned onto any road. Drummond came in his good coat, an old man who had been frightened, and had told the truth in time, and he wept all through the service and was not ashamed. Halsworth Hall they let go, in the end, to the next quiet cousin in the line, a decent man with no taste for arsenic, for Charlotte had no wish to keep house in the rooms where Ormond had died, and Marius had schemed. They lived instead at Wessenden Court, and the books of that estate were soon the most honest in the county, kept in a clear hand by candlelight at a table the Earl had set near the library fire, so that his wife need never begrudge the wax again. On a night the following winter, with the snow coming down soft and steady past the tall windows and a fire of applewood burning low, Sebastian came into the library and found her at the long table, with a lamp lit, though the curtains were not yet drawn and the household accounts open before her. Tant. On her cheek, he stood in the doorway, longer than a man need stand to look at his own wife. Then he crossed the room and set his hands on her shoulders, the way he had wanted to from the beginning, and she leaned her head back against him. And neither of them spoke, because the thing between them had never needed many words. On the table beside the open book lay a single dried rose, brown now and brittle. The last of the late roses she had been cutting on a terrace, 2 autumns gone, when a careless woman taught her what the world had decided she was. She had kept it. She did not quite know why she had kept it, except that a thing must be kept to remember that it was survived. The firelight moved over it, and over the open ledger, and over the 2 cold hands that were never cold any more, and the snow came down past the windows of a house where the books were honest, and the word the world had tried to bury a woman under had been answered, at the last, by a frightened girl who counted a guinea against a kindness, and found the kindness weighed more. If the long road that brought the Duchess of Wensley out of that cold hall and into this warm and snowbound room moved you, stay a moment in it before you go, and remember that the smallest voice in the room is sometimes the one the great forgot to silence. Then let the fire burn down, and let the snow fall, and let her rest.